You also talked about the 1200 megahertz of new spectrum. So how does that compare? So in the 5 gigahertz band, which today has been the best band that we have, 5 gigahertz. In 5 gigahertz, what do we have, Mitchell? Just rough numbers. How much
Rough,
frequency approximately?
rough numbers. So I want to say it's like what, somewhere around 500 megahertz of bandwidth, 600 megahertz bandwidth. And we can break those into channels, right? 20 megahertz channels, 40 megahertz channels, and 80 megahertz channels, and some, one or two 160 megahertz channels, right? Well, you just heard, but there's only so much bandwidth there. And so when you start looking at the number of 20 megahertz channels, you're at about 20, 24. 80 megahertz channels, you're somewhere around 15, 16. And then the 160, you're at 2. Well, that's kind of limiting. Doesn't really allow a lot of reuse for those higher bandwidths, right? So I could push those higher throughputs down to the clients, right? Because whenever I push that higher throughput, that means that client can regurgitate what it wants to regurgitate through that whole bandwidth and get off and move on, right? If I have to have a really long conversation over a smaller bandwidth, I'm going to eat up that airtime. So we want to get those bandwidths wider. So now we have this 1200 megahertz, which is going to allow us to have as many 80 gigahertz channels as we have 20 megahertz channels in the 5 gig, right? And then we're going to have like as many 16 or 160 megahertz channels as we do 80 megahertz channels. So I mean we're doubling the capability of the Wi-Fi just by having that larger band.
Okay, so going from 500 to 1200, that's over double. That's
right.
But even of the 500 you mentioned in the 5 gigahertz, a big chunk of that is controlled, the access to about 300 megahertz of the 500. So 3/5 of it is locked up in DFS access rules.
Exactly.
So yeah. So why? How does that impact your numbers now?
Well, I mean, if I'm a shared space, right? DFS, that's really what it is. If I hear somebody broadcast that's not necessarily a Wi-Fi, I have to move channels because it's used by other things. One of the big things that it's used by is Doppler radar. So if I hear a Doppler radar signal, I got to move. So, and in some ways, it's a useful, unuseful band, right? I could use it. I mean, even some of the low-end clients don't even talk on the DFS band. Right. So I mean, it's there, but it's not there, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, it just the access rules makes it very difficult. So now if you take out that 300 and call it, say you have 180 to 200 left over, and you're going to go from, let's say, 200 to 1200, that's now a 6-fold increase of very usable contiguous spectrum. And that's why the 1200 megahertz of spectrum is oftentimes the number one thing you see when people talk about Wi-Fi 6E. They always talk about 1200 megahertz of new spectrum, the greatest expansion since 1999. And it is. It's actually true. But there's always a catch, right?
Well, you got to have some rules, right?
Yeah, what rules? We don't need those thinking rules.
Yeah, rules are for the other guy, right? But no, seriously, you're going to have some rules, right? So I mean, we're going to have to, you already talked about one of the rules, AFC, right? Because we don't want to, contend with people already utilizing the space. Then you're going to have power restrictions, right? Depending on where you're at and what you're doing. As well as whether it's indoor or outdoor use, right? Because if I'm outdoor use, I am more likely going to have the possibility to interfere with one of those people that are using that outside the band, outside area for point-to-point communications, or the news companies using it to stream back to their news office for them to report live on site, or even satellite, right? So those guys definitely need to have that AFC, so this way that we don't interfere with each other, and basically give everybody a bad experience.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but indoors, we got power constraints to help us not to overstep our area, right? And not necessarily interfere with those incumbents.